Sweat stung Morgan's right eye, pooling in the crow's feet she'd earned staring through glass for a living, 2.4 kilometers. A mile and a half of dead air, crosswinds, and bad choices. Radio chatter called it impossible. She just called it Tuesday. 72 hours. That's how long it takes for a human being to stop feeling like a person and start feeling like a piece of the local geology. Morgan lay flat on a bed of crushed shale, her sternum grinding against a rock that had felt like a pebble 3 days ago and now felt like a railroad spike. The hide was a cramped, miserable crevice overlooking a nameless valley in a country that had been bleeding since before she was born. It was too low to sit up in, too narrow to roll over. They had shimmied in like snakes on a Tuesday night under the cover of a moonless dark. It was now Friday afternoon. It smelled, not like danger or glory, but like the miserable reality of the human body. Stale urine trapped in chemical bags, sour body odor, the copper stench of unwashed skin, and the sharp metallic tang of rifle oil baking in the merciless midday sun. Her ghillie suit, painstakingly woven with local dead brush and jute, felt like a burlap coffin that had been left in a sauna. Ants' tiny aggressive red things had found her left boot 48 hours ago. She had let them bite her ankle until the nerve ending simply gave up and went numb. Movement meant compromise. Compromise meant death. Next to her, Russo slowly peeled a piece of dead skin from his cracked lower lip. He didn't make a sound. Russo never did. He was a farm kid from Idaho who treated war like a particularly stubborn tractor engine that just needed the right wrench. He stared through the massive spotting scope, his right eye a permanent, wrinkled squint, his breathing so shallow it barely moved his ribs under his armor plate. "He's moving," Russo whispered. His voice was the sound of dry leaves crushing together. Morgan didn't flinch. She just pressed her cheek tighter against the synthetic stock of the 416 Barrett. The material was hot, slick with her own grease. She blinked, clearing a film of alkaline grit from her eye, and stared through the Schmidt and Bender glass. 2.4 kilometers down the valley floor, the compound looked like a kid's sandbox toy, wavering in the violent heat mirage boiling off the desert floor. A convoy of 3 rusted Toyota Hilux trucks rolled through the rusted iron gates. Powdered earth plumed behind them, settling heavily on the mud brick walls. "Got him," Morgan breathed. A man stepped out of the middle truck. He was wearing a stark white dish dasha, glaringly bright against the drab browns and tans of the earth. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like an accountant who had missed a few meals, maybe someone's tired uncle. But the intel dossier burned into Morgan's memory said differently. He was the architect of the IED network that had turned 3 Marines into red mist a month prior. "Range him," Morgan said. Russo's thick, calloused fingers danced over the laser rangefinder. 2,412 meters. Morgan's jaw tightened. She didn't say anything. The number hung in the suffocating air between them. 2,400. Most snipers, the ones who write books and go on podcasts, trained for 1,000 meters. 1,500 is a master class in applied ballistics. 2,000 is where math starts to break down, where the Earth's atmosphere turns into a fluid, chaotic soup, and luck takes the wheel. 2,400? That was a bad joke. It meant the bullet would be in the air for over 5.5 seconds. It meant the wind currently shifting in 3 different, conflicting directions across the vast expanse of the valley would have a lifetime to push the heavy, aerodynamic chunk of brass and lead off course. Russo keyed his mic. "TOC, this is Manticore 1. Jackpot is on the board. Range is 2412. Static hissed in their earpieces. Then, the crisp, modulated voice of Captain Fletcher came through. He sounded like he was sipping a macchiato. "Manticore 1, TOC. Repeat range." 2412, Russo said. A pause. The satellite delay made it feel longer than it was. "Manticore 1, that's outside the weapons system's envelope. Probability of kill is below threshold. You are no-go for the shot. I repeat, hold fire. Stand by for extract protocol." Morgan closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. A bead of sweat, stinging with salt, ran down her nose and dropped onto the safety selector of her rifle. She hated Fletcher. Not because he was a coward, he wasn't. He just liked rules, but because he trusted his glowing screens and algorithmic probability matrices more than he trusted her pulse. He was sitting in an air-conditioned command center, looking at a digital map. She was lying in the dirt, feeling the rhythm of the valley, tasting the dust in the air. "Copy, TOC," Russo said, his voice flat. He looked at Morgan. He didn't reach to pack up the spotting scope. He didn't touch the camouflage netting. He just looked at her. Morgan stared down through her glass. The man in white was lighting a cigarette. She could see the tiny, pathetic flare of the match through the magnification. She was the first female SEAL to make it through the sniper pipeline. The media would have loved to paint her as some trailblazing feminist icon, breaking glass ceilings with a high-powered rifle, a neat narrative for morning television. The reality was much uglier, stripped of all romance. She didn't care about ceilings. She cared about the fact that her knees ached with early-onset arthritis, that she hadn't had a normal menstrual cycle in 2 years due to cortisol overload, and that she was currently lying in her own filth, holding her breath while an ant crawled up her calf. She didn't want to shoot this man to prove a point to the Pentagon or to the boys' club. She wanted to shoot him because if she didn't, she'd have laid on this miserable rock for 3 days for nothing, and he'd go on wiring artillery shells to flip phones. "Wind?" she asked. Russo didn't hesitate. He didn't remind her of the captain's order. He didn't blink. He just leaned his weight back into the tripod of his glass. "Mirage is boiling left to right at the midpoint," Russo muttered, his eye locked on the target area. "You've got a full-value crosswind coming out of that draw at about 800 meters out. Call it 12 knots. It dies completely at 1500, dead calm. Then it picks up right to left at the target, maybe 5 knots, soft." Morgan processed the numbers. It was a ballistic nightmare. The bullet would get pushed violently right by the strong canyon wind, coast through a dead zone where gravity would pull it down exponentially, and then get gently nudged back to the left just before it arrived. "Elevation," she demanded, her voice tight. "Target is at 4 to 1,000 feet above sea level. We are at 6 to 1,000. Density altitude is screaming high. The air is thin. It'll fly flatter than at sea level, but it's still dropping like a stone after 1,500. Morgan reached up and gripped the elevation turret on her scope. The knurled metal was rough, biting into her thumb. She started dialing. Click, click, click. Every click of the turret was a physical commitment, a defiant middle finger to the voice in the radio. She wasn't just adjusting pieces of glass inside a metal tube. She was trying to bargain with the atmosphere. She dialed in the massive drop. The reticle moved drastically down inside the scope, forcing her to aim high into the sky. She dialed in the spin drift, the natural aerodynamic tendency of the bullet to drift to the right due to the right-hand twist of the barrel's rifling. Then, the Coriolis effect. The Earth rotates from west to east. Because she was shooting due north, the target would literally move slightly eastward during the bullet's multi-second flight. She dialed 2 clicks left to compensate for a planet that refused to hold still. "TOC to Manticore 1, Fletcher's voice barked in her ear, no longer crisp, but sharp with annoyance. "Sensors show you are still in position. I gave you an order, Chief. Pack it up." Morgan reached up to her chest rig and clicked her radio off. Russo saw the motion out of the corner of his eye. He smiled, a grim, humorless stretching of his split lips that exposed a line of white teeth. Without missing a beat, he reached down to his own chest rig and clicked his radio to off. The silence that followed was heavy, intoxicating. No static, no bureaucratic orders from a man who smelled like clean laundry. Just the hollow howl of the wind over the shale and the heavy, rhythmic thud of Morgan's own heart in her chest. She settled her cheek back onto the stock. The world narrowed down to a circle of magnified, distorted light. The man in white was walking toward the main building. He had maybe 20 seconds before he stepped inside the reinforced mud walls and disappeared forever into the labyrinth of the mountains. Morgan breathed in. The air tasted like copper, ozone, and old dirt. She breathed out. Halfway, her reticle, a complex grid of fine black hash marks, floated over the man. But she wasn't aiming at him. Not at this absurd distance. At 2,400 meters, you don't aim at the target. You aim at a patch of empty, meaningless air and pray the target walks into the bullet's inevitable arc. Her crosshairs hovered high and left of the man's head, suspended in the blurry, heat-distorted air far above a rusted, corrugated roof of a nearby shed. "He's stopping," Russo whispered, talking to a guy with an AK. Morgan felt a cramp seize her left hamstring, a sharp, violent knot of lactic acid and fatigue that threatened to shake her entire lower body. She ignored it. She forced the muscle to stay put. imagining the pain flowing out of her leg and into the rock beneath her. It was a mental trick she'd learned years ago, treading water in the freezing Pacific during Hell Week. Pain was just an electrical signal. You didn't have to answer the phone. "Wind at the canyon is picking up," Russo cautioned, his tone tight. 15 knots now. It's gusting. Watch the push." Morgan adjusted her point of aim another half mil to the left, shifting the massive rifle with microscopic pressure from her shoulder. The bipod feet dug a millimeter deeper into the rock. The man took a deep drag of his cigarette. He exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the still air. "Look at the smoke," Morgan said, her voice barely a vibration in her dry throat. Russo shifted his focus. Straight up, pluming straight, no wind at the target. The wind had died entirely at the bottom of the valley. The canyon crosswind was still raging halfway down the flight path. It was a schizophrenic, impossible atmosphere. "He's turning," Russo said, "facing our direction." The man stood still, looking up toward the distant, jagged ridgeline. He couldn't see them. They were a mile and a half away, buried in rock and shadow, invisible to the naked eye. But something, some primal, animal instinct, had made him pause and look up at the mountain. "This is it," Morgan thought. She let out the rest of her breath, emptying her lungs. The human body is an inherently unstable firing platform. It twitches, it pulses, the heart pumps blood, jarring the skeleton with every violent beat. At 100 yards, a heartbeat moves the crosshairs a fraction of an inch. At 2,400 meters, a heartbeat bounces the crosshairs 10 feet off the target. Morgan had to shoot in the empty space between the beats. Lube-dub. The crosshairs bounced over the corrugated roof. Lube-dub. She tightened her index finger on the trigger. It was a custom match-grade trigger, set to break at exactly 2.5 pounds of pressure. It felt like pressing against a thin rod of glass. Lub. In the vast, terrifying silence between the contraction of her heart chambers, Morgan applied the last ounce of pressure. The sear slipped. The firing pin slammed forward. Violence, at its core, is a mechanical transaction. The rifle didn't roar. It didn't thunder. It detonated. 42 pounds of precision machined steel shoved backward with the kinetic fury of a small car crash. The recoil pad slammed into Morgan's shoulder pocket, grinding bone against muscle, driving the air from her lungs in a sharp, involuntary grunt. Out the front, the massive clamshell muzzle brake redirected the exploding gases sideways. A shock wave of pulverized shale, dried spit, and dead insect husks blasted out in a flat fan across the hide. The dust coated her face, sticking instantly to her sweat-slicked skin, filling her nostrils with the sharp, acidic stench of burnt cordite. Morgan didn't blink. She rode the recoil, letting her body absorb the violence rather than fighting it, her cheek still welded to the stock. Her right hand immediately broke its grip, slapping upward to grab the bolt handle. Up, back, forward, down. The heavy steel cylinder cycled with a slick, metallic clack. A smoking brass casing, the size of a fat cigar, ejected from the chamber. It flipped in the air and landed directly on the bare skin of her right forearm. The brass was roughly 300 degrees. It seared the fine hairs and blistered the skin instantly. Morgan clamped her jaw shut until her molars ground together, refusing to flinch, refusing to pull her arm away. Pain was secondary. The scope was primary. She kept her eye glued to the ocular lens, staring through the swirling dust kicked up by the shot. "Time of flight," Russo droned, his voice utterly devoid of adrenaline. He was already counting. 1, 2. The bullet was now traveling at over 2,000 feet per second, tearing through the thin mountain air. It was a monolithic, solid copper projectile, a sleek dart designed to cheat the wind, but it was currently fighting a losing battle against the chaotic physics of the valley. 3. Morgan watched the boiling mirage through the glass. Her vision was slightly blurred, the concussion having rattled the fluid in her inner ear. A dull, high-pitched ringing whined beneath her noise-canceling headset. She hated this part, the helplessness. Once the firing pin struck the primer, her job was done. She ceased to be an operator and became a spectator to her own math. She was acutely aware of her aching bladder, the raw chafe of the nylon chest rig against her ribs, the terrifying absurdity of what she had just attempted. You don't hit a man at 2,400 meters. You just don't. The bullet is in the air for over 5 seconds. In that time, the target could take a step. They could bend over to tie a shoe. A localized thermal draft could push the bullet 3 feet high. A sudden drop in barometric pressure could drag it 5 feet low. It was a lottery ticket scratched with a trigger. 4. In her mind's eye, she visualized the bullet's arc. It had already peaked, cresting in a massive parabolic curve high above the valley floor. Now, gravity was yanking it downward. It was hitting the transonic zone, the turbulent barrier where the bullet slows from supersonic to subsonic speed. This was where accuracy usually fell apart. The shockwave would detach from the nose of the bullet, buffeting the rear, causing it to wobble, to yaw, to lose its perfect gyroscopic stability. I aimed at a cloud, she thought, a bitter spike of cynicism cutting through her focus. I aimed at a patch of empty sky to kill a man I can barely see. I'm an idiot. 5. Through the Schmidt and Bender glass, the man in the white dish dasha was still standing there. He was just lowering the cigarette from his mouth. He hadn't heard the shot. The sound of the rifle would take over 7 seconds to reach him, trailing far behind the supersonic hunk of copper screaming down from the sky. Morgan held her breath again, entirely by accident. Her stomach twisted into a tight, cold knot. Miss, her brain told her. It's going to impact harmlessly in the dirt 100 yards to his left. Fletcher is going to court-martial you for insubordination, and you're going to spend the next 10 years inventorying boots in a windowless warehouse in Virginia. Impact, Russo said. It wasn't like the movies. There was no dramatic backwards flying, no theatrical spray of red mist, no slow-motion collapse. Real bodies don't behave like Hollywood stuntmen wired to cable harnesses. Real bodies are just sacks of water, bone, and electrical impulses. When you sever the central nervous system with a 400-grain piece of metal traveling at the speed of a commercial airliner, the electricity simply shuts off. The man in white didn't fall. He folded. 1 microsecond he was standing, exhaling smoke, and the next, his knees unlocked, his spine lost all structural integrity, and he dropped straight down into the dust, like a marionette whose strings had been violently severed with a pair of shears. He collapsed onto his own legs, a crumpled, formless pile of bright white cotton against the dull brown earth. A beat of utter silence passed. Even the wind seemed to hesitate. Down in the compound, the guard with the AK-47 didn't react immediately. He just stared at the pile of white cloth at his feet, his brain utterly failing to process how a man standing next to him had suddenly ceased to function without a single sound echoing in the valley. Morgan didn't exhale. She stared through the reticle, watching for movement. Nothing. Just the dust slowly settling around the crumpled form. Splash, Russo whispered. His eye was still pressed hard against the spotting scope. For the first time in 3 days, there was a microscopic tremor in his voice. Center mass. Target is down. Target is severely down. Morgan finally let the breath out. It didn't come out as a sigh of relief. It came out as a ragged, wet gasp. Her lungs burned. Suddenly, the adrenaline dump hit her. It wasn't a rush of power or euphoria. It was a toxic, nauseating wave of chemical fatigue. The massive spike of cortisol and epinephrine that had kept her razor sharp for the last 2 minutes suddenly crashed, leaving behind a hollow, shaking shell. Her right hand, still gripping the bolt handle, began to tremble violently. She pulled it away, pressing her palm flat against the jagged shale, trying to ground herself. Her stomach heaved. She clamped her mouth shut, swallowing down a surge of sour bile that burned the back of her throat. "Don't puke in the hide," she ordered herself. "Do not puke on your own rifle." She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her forehead against the back of her dusty glove. The burn on her forearm from the spent brass throbbed, a sharp, localized agony that actually helped cut through the dizzying nausea. "Hey," Russo said. His voice was back to its normal, dry leaves timbre. Morgan opened her eyes and looked at him. He was looking at her, his dirt-caked face impassive, save for a slight, approving, tight-lipped nod. "Good dope," he said. It was the highest praise he was capable of delivering. Data on previous engagement. The math was good. Morgan didn't smile. She didn't feel victorious. She felt like a janitor who had just successfully unclogged a particularly disgusting toilet. It was a job. It was done. And she was covered in shit. "Radios," Morgan rasped, her throat feeling like it was lined with sandpaper. She reached up to her chest rig and flipped the dial. Immediately, the earpiece crackled to life, filled with the clipped, furious barking of Captain Fletcher. "Core 1, you are off comms. I say again, Manticore 1, acknowledge. If you have compromised this operation..." Morgan keyed her mic. She kept her voice flat, stripping every ounce of adrenaline and exhaustion out of her tone, projecting nothing but bored professionalism. TOC, this is Manticore 1. Good comms. A heavy, static-filled pause. Fletcher was likely staring at his screens in the air-conditioned TOC, his face turning an interesting shade of purple. Manticore 1, Fletcher said, his voice dangerously low. You disobeyed a direct hold-fire order. You went dark on comms. Give me one good reason I shouldn't send a QRF to arrest you on the mountain. Morgan looked down the valley. Through the scope, the compound was now swarming like a kicked anthill. Armed men were running out of the buildings, dragging the white pile of cloth behind the mud walls, pointing their rifles aimlessly at the surrounding ridges. They were terrified. The ghost had touched them. TOC, Manticore 1, Morgan said, her lips barely moving. Jackpot is down. I repeat, jackpot is neutralized. Confirming 1 KIA. Stand by for BDA. There was another long silence on the radio. Morgan could almost hear the gears turning in Fletcher's head. He was doing his own calculus now. A court-martial for insubordination versus taking credit for the longest confirmed sniper kill in the history of the theater, eliminating a high-value target that had haunted their task force for 6 months. Bureaucracy was predictable. Fletcher's voice came back, the anger entirely replaced by crisp, detached efficiency. Copy that, Manticore 1. Good work. QRF is standing down. You have 50 mics to nightfall. Begin exfiltration protocol. See you at the barn. Copy. TOC. Manticore 1 out. Morgan clicked the radio off. She rolled onto her back, breaking her silhouette for the first time in 3 days. The movement was excruciating. Her lower spine felt like it was fused together with rusty rebar. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet hide. The ants on her left ankle scrambled furiously as she finally brushed them away, leaving behind a constellation of swollen, red welts. She looked up at the sky. It was a brilliant, unfeeling blue, vast and empty. He's going to claim he authorized the shot, Russo grunted, beginning the meticulous process of breaking down the heavy spotting scope and sliding it into his padded drag bag. Let him, Morgan said. She reached for the hydration bladder tube clipped to her shoulder strap. She bit down on the rubber valve and sucked. The water was the temperature of hot soup and tasted strongly of plastic and old iodine. It was the best thing she had ever tasted. She sat up, groaning quietly as her hamstrings screamed in protest. She reached over and picked up the massive 416 rifle. The barrel was still radiating a fierce heat. She loved the gun, and she hated it. It was a tool that demanded perfection from a distinctly imperfect creature. 17 miles to the extraction point, Russo noted, looking at his GPS wrist unit. Uphill, most of it through loose scree. Perfect, Morgan deadpanned, wiping a mixture of sweat and rifle grease from her forehead, leaving a dark smudge across her skin. I was just thinking I haven't carried a 90-pound pack up a mountain lately. They worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, erasing all evidence of their existence from the cramped rock crevice. They buried their chemical waste bags deep in the loose shale. They gathered every piece of loose camouflage netting, every empty food wrapper. Finally, Morgan knelt and picked up the single spent brass casing. It was still warm to the touch. She slipped it into a dump pouch on her belt. Leave no trace. They shrugged on their massive packs. The weight was crushing, settling heavily onto Morgan's bruised collarbones and hips. She adjusted the padded straps, wincing as they pressed into raw skin. Russo took the point, a silent, shuffling shadow moving out into the fading evening light. Morgan followed, her boots crunching softly on the shale. She didn't look back down into the valley. There was nothing left to see. The math was finished. The ghost was walking home. The sun dipped behind the jagged western peaks, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the desert floor. The temperature began to plummet instantly, the blistering heat evaporating, replaced by a biting, high-altitude chill. Morgan shivered, her sweat-soaked base layers turning icy against her ribs. She put one foot in front of the other. The adrenaline was entirely gone now, leaving only the dull, rhythmic throb of her aching joints and the heavy, metronomic swing of the rifle slung across her chest. 2.4 kilometers. She shook her head slowly in the dimming light. It was an impossible shot, a stupid, reckless, statistically impossible shot. I'm never doing that again, she promised herself, her boots grinding into the rocky trail. But as she walked into the deepening dark, her fingers absent-mindedly brushed against the warm brass casing in her pouch, feeling the hard, mechanical reality of the impossible thing she had just done. If this gritty dive into the reality of modern sniper operations kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button to let us know. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into military history, tactical breakdowns, and untold stories from the front lines. Share this video with someone who appreciates the raw, unvarnished truth of combat. Drop a comment below. What's your take on a 2,400-meter shot?